Good morning, everyone. For folks who are joining us from here in Eastern Standard Time, and good day to our friends from other parts of the globe. We have a really international webinar for you today, and I'm really excited to be your host today. My name is Lloyd Rang. I am President and Narrative Lead here at Curious Public. And this is a webinar series that we host quarterly. And if you like the discussion today and you want to see more, you can check out the webinar section of our website at Curious Public to find our past episodes. So what brings us here today? Well, media have always been the gatekeepers of public knowledge, but media is shrinking. And that means that truth is harder and harder to come by for a lot of us. So how do we know what is true? Well, we go to trusted sources. But who are these trusted sources? And how do we become a trusted source as communicators working for organizations and as professionals? And in a world where media is shrinking, how do we get our story across? That's the real question we're trying to answer today. And to help me dig into that, we have a fantastic panel of experts from marketing, communications, technology, and information. So let me introduce you to them. So first, all the way from Ireland, Kevin Twomey. Kevin leads marketing at NewsWhip, which is an AI-powered media intelligence platform that is trusted by Google, Diageo, and other top publishers. Kevin's expertise helps global leaders and brands connect with the platform so that they can track, analyze, and forecast the spread of news and information as it happens. So thanks for joining us all the way from Dublin, Kevin.
Thanks very much for having me, Lloyd. You've always had the way with words. Thanks for the kind introduction.
You're very welcome. And Molly. Molly Morgan is another great panelist from across the pond. Molly is the Group External Communications Director at Bupa, which is a British multinational health insurance and healthcare company. Molly has a passion for international strategy and an outstanding track record for delivering internal and external communications programs that add a lot of value to businesses. And we're also very lucky to have Molly on our Curious Public Advisory Board as well. So thank you for being here, Molly.
Good to be here. Thanks, Lloyd.
Yeah, and where are you joining us from today, Molly?
London. I know I'm Canadian by birth, but I live in the UK.
Awesome. Yeah, that's the other London for Ontarians.
Yes, not Ontario.
And Jason Grier. Jason is the president and CEO of Delphic Research, which is a pioneering intelligence and communications platform that's been designed to meet the evolving needs of government affairs professionals and gaps in information from traditional news outlets. Jason brings to our discussion nearly 30 years of experience in public affairs, communications, and healthcare policy. So it is a real pleasure to have you here today, Jason.
Lloyd, good to be with you.
Great. There he is. And he's wearing a suit. He looks great. And last but not least, Jocelyn Butler. So Jocelyn is with us today, and she is the president and media director of Orchestra Marketing, an instrumental, pun intended, digital agency in the age of influencer and experiential marketing. And Jocelyn is a digital marketing expert who specializes in strong data for strong insights, strategy, and creative. So welcome, Jocelyn.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, where are you today, Jocelyn?
I'm just in downtown Toronto today.
Okay, just in Toronto. All right. All right.
It feels inferior right at the moment with visitors.
So we have lots of questions for our guests today, but each of you on the chat today can participate as well. You can weigh in, ask questions through the chat, and we'll try to get to them as we go through the session today. So I'm going to start with a lightning round of questions for everyone. So as quickly as you can, to each of you, how has the influence of the media changed since you first started your career? And we'll start with Kevin. What do you think?
Well, I'm going to slightly age myself, but I think to put things in perspective, I did my dissertation in university on the advertising effectiveness of MySpace, which for people on the phone or on the call might not know what it was, but it was pre-Facebook. So I'm still trying to figure out the advertising effectiveness of social media to this day. But yeah, that might date me. So it's changed quite a bit since the days of MySpace.
Molly, what about you?
Yeah, this also made me feel really old thinking about this. I think between now and then, mainstream media that once kind of its mission was to represent both sides of the debate. You could open any newspaper and basically get both sides of the story, if you will. Those kind of outlets have decreased in influence, and niche blogs, user-generated content have risen in influence. And I think that's really down to the fact that niche, it reinforces and reflects the inherent biases of the readers. And humans, we like an easy path. And so we're going to read what doesn't challenge us.
Jason, how about you?
Well, definitely, it's shrunk quite a bit. The number of outlets and also the number of reporters for those outlets. Much of my career I spent at Queen's Park, and I remember the Queen's Park Press Gallery from 30 years ago. Occupied a lot of space, had a bar and all those things, and now it's a dwindling number. I also was a lobbyist on and off for Canada's newspaper industry for 6 years. So, I was kind of within the publishing world and saw firsthand kind of the decline, and the association such was managing the decline of an industry. I think for me, I think the biggest impact I saw is that our reliance on news media sources as, in a sense, a public record, these journals of record, it no longer exists.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of the same vintage as you, political staff wise, and we used to get clips, media clips printed out, dropped on our desk every morning, killing untold numbers of trees. That doesn't happen anymore. Jocelyn, how about you?
Sorry for the background noise if you can hear the sirens, but I think honestly, it's obviously become extremely siloed. I think also just the competition with general entertainment is really, really hard, which has really created a lot of polarizing outlets that are out there. We actually just posted, we do a weekly update, and we just posted about the impact of influencers in media at this point. And a Pew study actually said 21% of all adults are getting their news from influencers on social media, X being the priority, mostly male dominated. 40% of individuals under 30 are getting it from social, getting their news from social. So just even that level of change in terms of getting, again, the short clips, the quick information, the information that validates our own opinions, has been a huge change in how it's changed since I've been in my career. So,
Well, and that's first of all, it's amazing data. Second of all, you said something that could be a whole other webinar, which is blurring the line between entertainment and news.
oh
Right?
yeah.
That we could dig into that all day, but I really like that that insight. So thanks a bunch for that. Okay, so I think we're all agreed. Legacy media is kind of dwindling, and media consumption is changing. It's fragmented, which is changing the game for communications. So the question is, where do we get our news now? Like what is, and Jocelyn hinted at some things. Kevin, what are your thoughts on that? Where are we getting our news right now?
Yeah, Jocelyn's spot on. And the really this was a catalyst at the US election. And there was a piece that came out, I think it was the Columbia Journalism Review, saying like everyone sort of had their own view of the election, and their own sort of cable network pipes directly into their phone, giving them their own perspective, similar to what Molly was saying, based on the views and what they're looking for. The days of sitting around TV or going on NewYorkTimes.com or whatever it might be to get your news, it's just they're not gone. Don't get me wrong, they're certainly not gone. It's just changing. And yeah, the rise of TikTok and Instagram really is probably the biggest surprise that we're seeing in terms of news consumption. So just to give you some context, the company I work for, NewsWhip, we track and monitor the spread of news across web and social media. We track it at an engagement level. And back around 10 or 12 years ago, we were set up to help newsrooms predict what was going to be viral. And that hasn't changed today. People are still looking to see what's spreading across the internet. And we have seen this massive shift from what was typically, okay, I'm going to see the New York Times article, go on their website, or the Guardian or the Journal or the Globe and Mail, read their story there. That has changed. The consumption has changed. We have seen a massive shift to TikTok and Instagram. We're talking like in the billions of engagements per year these platforms are getting. So TikTok and Instagram definitely an up and coming and probably quite dominant. And we're seeing more and more of the traditional legacy media platforms actually having huge success in these platforms. So it's not that the legacy media is dead. They're just massively adapting how they share their content. The likes of the Daily Mail in the UK having huge success. Lad Bible as well, which you might be familiar with, having huge success on these platforms. And what's really interesting is that different types of publications are having huge success on different platforms. Lad Bible is huge on Facebook. Facebook is not gone. Daily Mail, as I mentioned, huge success on TikTok. Also, The Economist and the Financial Times having huge success on TikTok. So it's not just cat videos that's on TikTok, it's huge news consumption that's also taking place there. And it's not from what we might think are untrustworthy sources. There are a huge amount of former journalists and audience dev managers at some of the most prestigious publications in the world that are now going out on their own and setting up their voice and their platform on these new social channels and having huge success. Mo News is one example. Former journalist, I suppose always a journalist, now has almost 500,000 followers on Instagram. And he has a direct audience. And the big shift is that he's telling news in the way that people want to consume it. And that's been the big shift.
And any other thoughts from other members of the group before we
You mentioned the two outlets that I get targeted with the most in terms of the algorithms on all platforms. Daily Mail and Lad Bible come up on my platforms every day, at least 6 times a day, because they have been doing a really great job. I love that.
Well, I think the other thing with Daily Mail and with Lad Bible is they've done a really good job of segmenting their audience. So there's Lad Bible Sport that you can talk to. There's Daily Mail's celebrity news is consumed massively around the globe. And so you don't have to go and read their nasty headlines all the time. You can actually just go and read their nasty celebrity headlines. And so it is really finding their niche and finding their audience and what their audience loves as well.
So Jason, I'm gonna pick on you for a sec. Your company has an interesting approach to this. You actually kind of peer into the news, into the future before it actually happens. So looking ahead yourself, what do you think the role of news prediction is? And maybe talk a little bit about how you do that, and then talk to me about what you think the role of news prediction is going to be, because that's a really interesting way of thinking about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of, you think about something by the time it gets in the news, and now we have sort of these alternate news sources, et cetera. They didn't kind of pop out of nowhere. They're in response to an issue or things that have kind of been developing. So, even prior to this shrink and the decline of news media, traditional news media, there's always been that opportunity to kind of see things coming down the pike. And how do you do that, right? So how are you, helping to position yourself to know something is likely to happen or not likely to happen? And that's by peering more into the past, if you will, in terms of information sources. So looking at direct sources, looking at those newsmakers, tracking those sources of intelligence that are beyond the scope of news media is a key part of our strategy. And in part to answer your question with respect to what are the news sources that we cover, many are the sources of information that news media had traditionally relied on. So going direct to the source, tracking newsmakers who are increasingly on social media, and often we're breaking news on social media that we picked up on that has, that long before it gets into the news media.
One of the things I understand you guys do a little bit too is you look at some of the stuff that's going on in the background in government, right? So some of the like there's all these decisions being made in government every day that are kind of that people are data blind to, but you guys have a way of kind of peering into that decision-making apparatus and finding out what they're thinking about almost like before it makes the news.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So monitoring those direct sources, in a sense, what we do is a form of private journalism, private reporting, and there's less of a mediation of the media as, in a sense, the mediator or filter of that information. We're getting it directly. And, so thinking about the newspapers tomorrow, right? What's in the news tomorrow are things that are being talked about today, particularly when you're talking about sort of government reporting. So, not relying on that filter means you've got that information earlier. And there's lots of things that are being talked about that today in government that won't make the news tomorrow, won't make the news next week, but you can already get a sense that they're going to make the news 6 months from now. And so tracking that information and more of that data, if you will, is going to help build a more robust model of that world and give you a better opportunity to kind of predict what's going to happen down the line.
That's really cool, and it's cool technology that enables that. And speaking of technology, Molly, you worked for tech companies for a big part of your career, and technology's really allowed companies and organizations to become their own newsrooms. So, what's your advice to communications people on how to use technology to create news? Like, what tools do companies have at their disposal, and how do they work?
Yeah, I think couple thoughts. And again, don't think it's necessarily about creating your own news. It's how do you create content that disseminates your news, right? And I think again, as we all discussed, the fragmented and shrinking media market means that there's a greater chance of your message never being heard in the first place or being distorted. And so building your own channels like blogs, news microsites, again, you need to find tools that allow for direct communication with your target audiences, control over your narrative. And why I think a lot of companies go this direction is also it's instant publishing because you're in control of that button, right? And so I think a few things, there's a lot of tools out there, a few thoughts as far as just thinking about creating content that really resonates with your audiences. One, you have to think about visual storytelling. And I think we've all been talking just now about TikTok, about Instagram. And I do find it really funny how a lot of these started out as such a consumer platform. And I think as we all became more comfortable with them, we all became more comfortable giving advice to our senior stakeholders and say, well, actually, we can use this as a corporate communications tool. And it's just been really fascinating to watch the evolution. But anyway, so going back to visual storytelling, incorporating videos, infographics. I mean, I remember the days when you had to create an infographic and it took 2 weeks. Now you can do it almost instantaneously. And honestly, at Bupa here, we use Canva a lot. They've given me no money for that endorsement. But also Adobe Creative Cloud. Adobe Creative Cloud is also very good for creating visual content. Lumen 5 and Animoto, I'm not sure if anybody has used those for video creation. And of course, then for video hosting, there's Vimeo, which embeds really nicely into websites, as does YouTube, my former employer. I think, and others kind of talk about this quite a lot. The other really important thing to do and think about the tools about when you're creating content is all the social listening. Then there's a lot of tools out there and a lot of aggregators of tools as well, because we need to know what people are saying about us, the industry and relevant topics to be able to shape the content and address their interests and concerns. So a couple that have come to mind are Brandwatch, Sprinkler. I'm not sure if anybody's used Sprinkler. I love that name. Also Talkwalker, if anybody's familiar with that. And then I think the other thing, just to pick up on something that the rest of the panel were talking about earlier, is how do you leverage external voices? So influencers are a great propagator of your own content, and partnering with the right influencers, vetting them properly, and other organizations to create joint content, again, that amplifies your messages is it's a much bigger channel than it ever has been before. Just as an example, back in October at Bupa, we were really struggling to get people to come to one of our symposium events. We decided to partner with former Olympian Michael Johnson as our keynote speaker. We literally had him for 15 minutes, and all of a sudden, our TikTok users tripled. Well, no, we went from 50 to 300 million. It's just ridiculous. 1,000, I should say, not million, 1,000.
Oh, okay.
It's just the power of an influence. And again, we aligned with him because it's finding people that you align with your brand, right? We're a healthcare company. It also happened to be World Stroke Day. Michael Johnson had a stroke back in 2019. It all just came together really well. So you got to use influencers. And to identify influencers, actually at Google, we used to use BuzzSumo quite a bit internally. And then managing influencer relationships, there's tools like Tracker. And then Maverick, not spelled Maverick like Maverick and Goose, but a different spelling, helps you create influencer campaigns. And so do they work? They absolutely do work. You get control. You're in charge of your own messages. But I think the caveat with all of this is it's only as good. The success of that depends on the content of the quality of your content. And you still need to be an effective storyteller, and you need to be authentic. And if you're not also consistent in delivering those messages, you're never going to build trust. And so the human is still fundamental to all of this. And so those tools help us be better, but it doesn't replace our critical thinking and our ability to tell stories. So that's, in a nutshell, my thoughts.
Well, and that's awesome. And while you again, there's every sentence in what you just said, we could do a whole probably
yes
on. But I do want to pick up, like, you said using influencers to tell a story, which, I mean, we have an expert right here with Jocelyn, whose
Yeah.
company does exactly that. So Jocelyn, talk to me a little bit about how you guys advise companies who want to use influencers to tell a story, and what are some of the benefits and drawbacks, and how do you create boundaries so that, you know, if I'm using an influencer, my brand is adequately and properly represented, as opposed to, you know, kind of like the influencer taking control and potentially creating problems for my brand. Like, how do you create those guidelines?
Yeah, 100%. That's a lot of questions, and I'm gonna try and get through all of them. I think the first thing in terms of just selecting influencers is there's kind of four things that I try and look for. Credibility. Have they actually chosen a niche that they are working towards and actually making sure that they're a subject matter expert in, as opposed to just a broad spectrum person who's trying to get entertainment in an audience for no particular reason? I think that's a very important thing when you're looking at using influencers for brands. Second thing, we actually go and make sure your audience is relevant. So tools like Hype Auditor, BuzzSumo, anything like that can actually tell you whether their following is real, how engaged they are, where they're located. Again, that's a really big thing for brands. Like, you don't want to necessarily, you may have an influencer that's based in Toronto, but most of their followers are in the US. And while it may look like they may be highly valuable for a local brand, they're not going to be. So that's a really key piece of the puzzle. The other thing that I also look for is consistency in their messaging. If they're going every which way in terms of communication and changing their opinions far too frequently, I feel that those are way too high of a risk when it comes to incorporating a brand into their feeds. And that's not just products. Like, I think one of the biggest things whenever I talk about influencers is most people go to health and wellness and makeup. There are tons of different influencers out there. There's tons of value for various industries to use it as well. Whether they are a celebrity, an athlete, or just a general content creator, there's a ton of opportunities there to get into specific niche markets with a very specific communication piece. There's an opportunity also to just get that broad spectrum audience, just as Molly talked about, in terms of expanding what your personal audience is. Or your brand's audience is. I think some of the drawbacks is obviously everything that has to happen on their channel has to happen in their voice. So you do have some control of the messaging that they're putting out there. However, it has to be in their voice. And I think sometimes with brands, in particular when it's not-for-profits, social enterprises, anything that's more of a service or a B2B based business, I think there's some struggle there sometimes to let go of control of the communication and how something is being specifically said. So you got to be able to be willing to let go a little bit on that front. I think also when it comes to putting those boundaries, honestly, when somebody is being paid to actually speak about your business, or there is some level of exchange, that's a business contract. These influencers, in particular content creators, I think that there's some perception that they are not a business entity, and in fact they are, and you need to treat it as such. So contracts are definitely a really big deal. Making sure that the contracts outline a series of things, like if you're going to have the real estate on their feed of being a brand ambassador for XYZ organization, how long does that stay there? And if their message starts changing over the course of time and it doesn't actually align with the brand, how do you ask them to take it down without being misrepresented on their feeds for some sort of negative action? These things all can be built into contracts. I think the other thing is, and I speak to this a lot, is your story going to match what their feeds are like? And so therefore it's not just about the audience, but it's actually going to line up so people engage with the content. That's a really big deal. And I think also is your story going to pass the so what test when it goes into a more organic space like that? A lot of brands and a lot of people behind the brands are going, oh, we're so great, and this is why we're so great. But I love when people drink the Kool-Aid of the company that they work for. However, you also need to make sure that the audience is also going to do that. And one of the biggest pieces of that puzzle is making sure that your story, whatever communication you're putting out there, is going to pass that so what test once it hits those influencers.
One of the most influential books I read when I started my career in healthcare was a book called No One Cares About Your Hospital.
Ooh,
right?
I like that.
Which is like
Yeah.
stunning if you work in healthcare, but you realize it's true, right? Sometimes the thing that you work for is just not that, like, people don't want to think about it, because actually people don't want to think about healthcare if they don't have to think about healthcare. It's one of the truisms of healthcare, right? And so it's challenging in certain sectors because the client sometimes has this idea that what they're sitting on top of is a hidden gem, when in reality it's just difficult to communicate, or it's problematic in some way, and so it's that can be a bit challenging. I um I I wonder, Kevin and Jocelyn, if you could weigh in on this one for me, because this is one that kind of, I think you both would have a view on this. This is one that confuses me a bit because a lot of pundits, and Kevin, you touched on this at the top, thought that the influence of folks like Joe Rogan and others was a really crucial factor in the US election. And I mean, these folks not only, like broadcast the news, they make news themselves. And so they have they have an ability to sway opinion that is really quite outsized, and Joe Rogan's platform in particular, because he's massive on Spotify. But I wonder, it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the influencers in political opinion and in sort of social thought seem to be on one side of the political spectrum. They seem to have been earlier adopters. And I'm hard pressed to think of an equivalent on the side of like progressive politics or liberal leaning politics, that of a Joe Rogan or of somebody like that. And so I wonder, first of all, why is that? And are communicators doing enough to platform a variety of different kinds of voices as like for influencers? So I'll throw it to you first, Kevin, and then Jocelyn, why don't you weigh in on that?
That's a very dangerous question to be asking an Irishman to comment on the US.
Yeah.
So I'll tread carefully. So Lloyd, if I'm hearing your question correctly, are there conservative news influencers to the same degree as Joe Rogan?
I
And
mean,
if
I think Joe would probably be on the more conservative libertarian side, right? So the question is actually on the progressive liberal centrist side. Is there more like maybe that's my own bias, I don't know, but it just seems to me to be skewed one direction.
Yeah, I think you're right in viewing it that way. If you look at the top 10 podcasts at any given time, I think the only one that you might view as more liberal is the Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway Pivot podcast. They're constantly talking about how in a sea of red they're the only blue, constantly in the top 10. So I think you're right that there is more of a leaning towards non-progressive liberal news influencers. Why that is, I don't want to comment on that. I think maybe it's just it gets more news, it's more attention. But then there are other influencers such as Dylan Page. Like he had 6 million views just on him calling the election on the night of the election, which is huge numbers. And I think what brands and publishers need to understand is that the days of an MSNBC or CNN getting your combined 20 million views on something, these new news influencers and news creators are getting those numbers on their own. And I know like the big talking point of the election was, or one of them, I should say, was should Kamala Harris have done Joe Rogan? And maybe that's where she wasn't willing to budge. She got the power dynamics wrong, even though she was going for the president of the United States, the most powerful position in the world. She read that situation wrong and probably should have done the Joe Rogan podcast. And I know that's very easy to say in hindsight, but even though she had done Call Her Daddy, all these other ones, I think she missed a trick with that, because the Joe Rogan audience, it's in the tens of millions. I think it's around 50 million listens per podcast, which is just staggering. She got that one wrong. Would she have turned down CNN, MSNBC? I don't think so. So why did she turn down Joe Rogan?
Yeah. Jocelyn, thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts. I think this is gonna, as not a huge Joe Rogan fan, I think he actually gets a bit of a bad rap when it comes to his communication. He brings in audiences, like, yes, a lot of his audience is quite right leaning, but he does have a really broad spectrum listener base, first. Second, the people he brings in to interview aren't always very right leaning. He did for a period of time start swaying that way when he was building his audience, but he's come back a little bit more to the center Jon Stewart has commented about the fact that he is a very good interviewee or interviewer, and actually a really solid journalist in terms of the questions he asks. And while he may not necessarily agree with his general politics, he wouldn't necessarily say that it's a dangerous media platform for any left-leaning individual to go on. I think, honestly, with Kamala Harris, her media team made a huge mistake by trying to control the situation, going, you can have 30 minutes in my location and then you can interview me, instead of him going, no, like, this is how everybody does this on my podcast. Like, you're not going to control the narrative. And so that's where they said no. And I think that was a huge mistake for them. I think, honestly, on the right-leaning side, you looked at Trump, JD Vance, pretty much anybody, including Ted Cruz. They were not just going on and interviewing in spaces where they were safe. They were going on to other media outlets, other influencer podcasts, and speaking even to more left-leaning news outlets during the period of time of the campaign, whereas the Harris team didn't do the same thing. And I think that is really where, in the States, on the left-leaning side, there was a little bit too much playing it safe when there was a switchover in who the leader was, who was actually going out for president so late in the game. You should have been everywhere. And so I think that's my just general opinion on the media side.
One point on the Joe Rogan being a good interviewer. I think he's not at the standard of what we would call like your typically trained journalist. He doesn't ask hard questions. He's not probing. He doesn't really set traps. And I think that's even more of a reason why the Harris campaign got it wrong. It would have been an easy interview for Kamala Harris, and they completely got it wrong.
Yeah, I would agree.
I wonder if one of the things I've noticed, early on with technology, the division in the audience was, you get your news from online if you're younger, and you get it, from a paper if you're older, or from television if you're older, right? But it seems to me there's like now another bifurcation, which is that, like, you increasingly see older people getting their news online because they don't trust traditional media. There's like a built-in sort of like mistrust. So there's within the kind of political ecosystem, there's like, mainstream media can't be trusted. So therefore, I'm going to go to my online sources. And you see a lot of older people, getting their news from YouTube or from Facebook or from those sorts of sources, and from influencers and from other people. And so you had a very different view. I guess where I'm going with this is, you had a very different view of what the US election was about, depending on where you got your news from.
Yes.
Right. So if you got your news from influencers and online sources and like things that would like fly under the radar for people who are like watching traditional media, you had a very different kind of opinion of what was going on than you did if you used like traditional media sources. So I find that fascinating. And I think I think the lesson going forward for political communicators in particular, but also for other communicators, is like, you have to really pick where you're going to be, where you want your news to be deployed, right? Like, I find that fascinating. So anyway,
I would actually say you almost can't be too specific, because it's such a fragmented space now. Even though legacy media is consolidating, the consumption is massively fragmented. So you need to be making sure you're covering all bases, because there's blue sky, X is still a thing, believe it or not, threads and so on, that you need to make sure that you are covering all your platforms. And just on your point about the decline in traditional media, especially amongst younger audiences and demographics, that Pew research that Jocelyn mentioned, like year over year, there's just a massive decline in national and local news is declining. Social media and online news is just on the up, and it's not quite crossed yet, but it's getting there.
Well, it's funny you mentioned threads too, because my experience of using threads is that the algorithm works so well that it feeds you only and exactly what you need. And if something comes in from outside of your interest, you can block and hide so effectively and easily that you're creating a hermetically sealed echo chamber every time you have that experience. So you're having a very different experience on threads. It's even more, I think, sealed off than X or Twitter was, right?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see that happen as well, right? Huh. Okay, so since we're talking about technology, and we'll go back to Molly and Jason for a second. The algorithms are bringing us what we want to consume, right? Like I just sort of said that a little bit, in a way that's sort of tailor-made for us. Is there a way to use AI, for example, or other tools to get the news out to exactly the right audience, to find the exact pipeline, to find, because as Kevin said, it's fragmented, but like, is there any way to pinpoint people a little bit more effectively or not?
Do you want to go first, Jason?
Yeah, yeah.
Go for it.
Oh, no, you go first because I'm going
All
to
right.
challenge that.
Yeah, I think first you need to know your audience. I think sometimes we forget about that and we move so fast with what we want to say that we always have to stop and we need to remember that we need to know who our audience is. And I think this is going back to your conversation about the US election. I think that politicians at the highest level have forgotten who they serve. And so there's a huge amount of disenfranchised people in that system that are turning to any voices that they feel they can trust because they feel so disconnected. And so I do think a couple really great AI tools are really for getting audience insights. And so BuzzSumo, I already mentioned, TrendSpotter, but equally like tools like Google Analytics, and also, again, I mentioned Sprinkler before, but getting deep insight into your audiences and how they behave is incredibly important for then targeting. And equally so, I think you have to use AI tools with a lot of transparency and ethics, and you have to have your own. There is no universal like, oh, if you drafted this LinkedIn post with AI, do you need to put a disclaimer on it? 9 times out of 10, you can tell.
Yeah.
But there needs to be a level of transparency and ethics. So if you are having AI generated content on your platform, whatever that platform is, I do think there needs to be some protocols put in place and transparency with your audiences. But then just at the positive end of the scale, there are some really amazing AI tools out there, and content customization is really important for reaching your audience, whatever channel you choose. So I'm sorry, I won't geek out too much. Natural language processing tools. And I'm saying, like, I don't know if anybody else uses Grammarly. I love the Grammarly plugin. Also Phrase, Phrase. It helps you adapt your content by suggesting changes that can make it more appealing to your audience or your demographic, right? So you can say, I'm writing this for somebody. But equally so, you can tell Gemini or ChatGPT the same thing. Here's my piece of content. I want you to write it I want you to write it so a lawyer will like to read it. Like, you can be that specific to make sure that the content resonates. And I won't keep talking. Jason, add your thoughts.
Well, social media has become hugely influential, stating the obvious. There are people who have a degree of media literacy, and hopefully we'll have more and more of that won't rely on what the algorithm's bringing them and won't rely on all the sources that are there. And that in particular is kind of the market we serve. There are tools, ours included, increasingly more and more tools that are able to scan more of the primary sources of information, official sources, et cetera. And so if you're in this space where that becomes relevant, making sure that your content is also, in a sense, being shared by government officials, politicians, or in official places is going to be really important, because the social media feeds, there's a high degree of mistrust there about the information that we see. And I think that mistrust was going to increase over time because we're often let down by folks on social media who have an agenda. They may have a great audience, but they're not always putting out the best information. So
Well,
for communicators, thinking about that, in particular, if you're in this space where official sources of record or officials or people who have a sort of more of a responsibility, if you will, around reporting things accurately. So like official records, et cetera. Many of you in your audience may actually go and check those things, check those facts. So being there will be important.
I would add one thing on that one with the AI stuff, is always being like on a source, like from sources in particular. A lot of these AI tools are still in their infancy, and the ability to fact check are still not there. I have conversations constantly with people saying, I've asked ChatGPT this, and the fact that they've provided is false or made up or fabricated in some way, shape, or form. So if anybody is using it for content production to speak to a particular person, in particular, if it's brought up facts, you've got to do your own due diligence fact check there, because quite often the facts are falsely are false in general. So
Yeah.
AI is only as good as the data that goes into it and the people that have inputted it.
yeah.
And I think we all need to remember that it's not this magical mystery solution. It's a new tool. And we used to always say AI has the answers to the questions that you haven't thought to ask yet. And we've got to continue to apply good judgment. And so for those of us that are in mentorship positions for more junior staff coming in, we also need to make sure that we still train on check your facts, just like Jocelyn said. Like I remember my beginning reporting class, if we didn't have 3 sources for a story, our professor failed us. And now somebody quotes somebody on X that has 3 followers and it's like fact. And so I think it's just it's using the tools, and because again, the more we use these tools, the better they get, but it is still applying really good human judgment.
Yeah.
One of the things I find with AI is that it's because there's so much mediocre content in the world, it tends, like, especially on the writing side, AI writing is kind of mediocre because it kind of it plays to the common denominator. So you can quickly spot it because it uses the same kinds of constructions, it uses the same sorts of same kind of vocabulary. It doesn't stand out, which makes it stand out, right? So you can kind of tell, you can kind of spot it quite quickly. And what's interesting is the more AI content that's produced, the more AI eats its own tail, right? So you're seeing AI consuming AI now as part of its, so it's really kind of, one of the best, I was at a conference in New Orleans actually a couple of weeks ago, and one of the best pieces of advice I got there was, create your own AI, your own internal AI, and if you're going to use it for content creation, train it on the content that you yourself create so that the AI lives up to the standard of your content and isn't aggressively following somebody else's content standards and racing to the bottom. So if your content is here, then make sure that the AI that you're using is for whatever purposes you're using it is tailored to the level of content that you yourself produce. So
Lloyd, just
yeah,
to add to your question, I think it was around, like, can AI help you identify where to place a story, or how we're seeing, so we work with New York Times, Axios, BBC, Deutsche Welle, and so on, and how they're using AI within NewsWhip is that we're helping them with summarization. There's huge volumes of data, which we all know, on a minute by minute basis. So with NewsWhip, we're helping them summarize the information as quickly as possible with citation, so that then we're actually helping, based on searches, if they're into the FIFA World Cup, Euros, on a particular topic, covering an event, whatever it might be, we're feeding them with inbox updates, summarizations with the key themes and topics to help them save more time on doing the analysis and heavy lifting, and more time to do identification of where there might be a new opportunity. So we're using AI really for summarization to help save time, and then for them to be more impactful identifying new story opportunities. And we're now seeing our AI digest like powering daily briefings and editorial meetings, and using that to inform but not dictate.
So that leads to another. There's a question actually in the chat that kind of like fits into that really nicely. I want to pull out for a second, which is, has the market for attention become so competitive that people are actually tuning out and unplugging as we reach a content saturation point? Because you're getting all this, you're getting daily briefings, you're getting social media feeds, you're getting traditional media, you're getting this, you're getting are we reaching a point where we're just not able to process information anymore?
I don't know if it's
I think we're able to process. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Jocelyn.
Yeah, I don't know if it's about processing the information, but having to be selective of where you're consuming things from is definitely key. There was a huge trend this summer with sort of the Gen Alpha, Gen Z on quiet walks, where kids were going for walks without their phone, which is such a shocker. But just that kind of piece, or people kind of deciding where they are searching for their information. There's more than 35 ways for people to search for information now. It's not just a basic search like Google or Bing. You can do it through TikTok. You can do it through any of the AI tools. You can do it through a variety of places. And so having to be, I think, because there's so much out there and there's so many ways in which you can consume things. I'm not sure if we're really just at a point that like everybody's dismissing everything. It's more about having to be selective of where you consume it so that you can process it as well.
Yeah, and Lloyd, so I think curation becomes really important. We're increasingly becoming, I think, a growing force in the market. So of course, the aggregators, but somebody who actually has an understanding of kind of your brain and how you look at information. Kevin gave an example about how his platform is providing daily briefings to the editorial room in the morning, so they have a sense of what's needed. The more people can, in the future, hand off some of that curation to a trusted provider of information, the better off they'll be, and they won't feel like they're drinking from an information fire hose. That somebody else is drinking it for them and providing them with the insights they need on a regular basis. So I think we'll see that increasingly as a trend down the road, as there are more and more information sources and people feel more and more overwhelmed.
You could do that with like Google News feeds early on. Like you could kind of like create, alerts for yourself. But in that case, you only get what you know already exists, right? Like if you're, looking for news on a certain company and that's your search term, you're going to get that news provided to you. But if you don't know what you're looking for, like that's what I like about curated news, like what you and Kevin are talking about, is that you get the stuff that you don't know that you need, but you still need it, right? Like, because it is kind of curated for you, and it's tailored for you in that way. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
it's
just
a
to
more
add,
sophisticated approach to build that model of what you're interested in than just asking for a set of keywords. So
Yeah.
it really does, and I think AI will be able to support more of this, developing an understanding of your information needs and why you need those things, and so that it can capture those things that you might not have realized you were looking for, but really needed. So we'll be able to do more and more sophisticated models like that over time.
and just one other thought to add is, again, I don't think that people are tuning out, but to a point that Jocelyn made at the very top of this meeting is that the blurring lines between entertainment and news is coming in thick and fast. And I think I really feel this is accelerated since COVID. And can you believe March 2025, it'll been 5 years. I think we've all become very overwhelmed by how much bad stuff, I almost swore, bad stuff there is out in the world. And so that shift is not necessarily that we're tuning out, but we're tuning into different things that aren't so hard to watch and to read and to listen to. And I do think that's part of the driver behind more entertainment-based news, because it just is too heavy sometimes. And so I don't necessarily think we're tuning out. I just think we're tuning into different places.
Takes us back to the
reason
cat
why Rogan is so popular. It's 3 hours of meandering,
Yeah.
easy lay of questions, and 50 million people do it. So I don't think there's content saturation, but if people are watching him for 3 hours.
It's a lot.
And like cat
Who has
videos
3
that you
hours?
mentioned before, Kevin, and mini hippos, and like all kinds of things to kind of like make us feel good about our lives and our choices, right? So
Exactly.
Yeah.
interesting question here from Dina Allen on the chat, or really comment I want to get your reaction to, which is she says, we're seeing a resurgence in the positive impact of print pieces in the social impact sector. A printed card goes a long way and has tactile appeal and emotional resonance. And it's sort of a reaction to digital overwhelm. And Jocelyn, you mentioned like Gen Z has gone so far around the bend that they're like ditching their phones now. Are we gonna see like, I don't know, resurgence of like the same way that we saw people sort of picking up like, vinyl albums? Are we gonna see people going back to like actual paper newspapers now? Like do we go around the bend at some point?
I think it's so funny because how many times in the marketing space has somebody been like, print's dead, or this is going to become dead, or any like radio's dead, when all it's done is really just adapt. Like we've come full circle on streaming services. We've got basic cable again. Everyone's getting advertisements in their streaming, no matter whether you pay for it or not. I think in terms of the printed stuff, yeah, it does have a huge impact. Print has there's nothing like a solid coffee table book. And to be honest, I've actually seen some realtors that are going back to that direction whenever they're going and trying to recruit new potential clients who want to sell their homes. So print does definitely have a huge impact still, because it is a different and more engaging piece. It's the same way that experiential has had a huge rise since post-COVID. Experiential marketing in general for any brand is a critical channel for us now, because that in-person and tactile experience and the physical experience is super important for brand resonance. And I think just in general, like, there's a lot of conversation now around SEO and that potentially dying because of the production of AI like ChatGPT. The reality is it's not, unless the DOJ actually does force Chrome to be sold off by Google. There's still 90% of the search market. It's not going away anytime soon. And so I think when it comes to how we're looking at various channels, especially with what Dina was talking about in terms of the social impact sector, is making sure you're covering your bases on multiple places and actually watching what the trends are in terms of marketing. Because there are things that are going to come full circle. There are things that come back up as, like, nostalgia is such a big play in terms of marketing and communications, and print has that piece to it in some cases. So that's why it's probably also doing extremely well for them.
So funny you said realtors, because just before this call, I was almost late for this call because my realtor, Lindsay Smith from Keller Williams, showed up at my door with a poinsettia for me to thank me for my business this year, right? And so you can't put a price on that, right?
Yeah.
I think it's really fascinating. And we just had a client actually just say to us, we don't want a social media campaign. We actually want a kiosk campaign. We actually want an in-person campaign in malls. We're kind of done in that space. Like, we've done everything that we can. We want to try in person now, which is really interesting because we haven't had that conversation in a while. So
experiential is honestly huge. I think that the sort of 1, 2, 3 punch in particular that I'm seeing right at the moment is, do you have an effective digital program? Do you have an effective experiential program? And do you have something that people can take home that they're actually going to use? And these are really, really important. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, to make sure that you're actually kind of covering your bases in communication. So that it makes total sense to me.
yeah. Okay, we're at 5 minutes left or 4 minutes left. Just a real quick lightning round again. So for each of you, what's your one piece of advice for organizations who are trying to tell their story out in the new world? And what is it? Let's start with Kevin again.
Ooh, good question. Trying to tell their story out in the world. Don't look at the internet as one homogeneous, one message will do across each platform. And I suppose with that advice, with 2 hats on. One, if you're a publisher trying to get your content out there, don't look at the rise of news influencers as the death of your industry. Far from it. Look at it as an opportunity and learn from influencers and news influencers about how they can be so reactive and get such great engagement on different platforms. And if you're a publisher, want to get your message out there, learn from them. Look at how Mo News is getting 400,000 views of content and so on. From a brand perspective, brands also always need to be cautious. They can put one foot wrong very, very quickly, and it can cost their share price. The thing I would say to them is put everything into context. They need to go beyond reach and impression numbers and really understand what people are engaging with online, and measure their issue or crisis or opportunity against that. Put it into perspective so you can make a better informed decision and plan your next step around getting a message out there. Because just shouting into a void can often make the issue worse. So really putting things into context, rationalize and contextualize, I would say, for brands.
Yeah. Molly, thoughts?
Said this before, but I'll repeat my key message. Know your audience. What they care about needs to intersect with why they should care about you. And I think, Joanna, just saw a question pop up in the chat. And I think, if I were to give recommendations to a small company about where do you focus, first you have to know where your audience is and where do they go for their information. And then that leads you to your decision about where you spend your money on. But you have to spend a bit of money on audience insights and audience analytics. And again, if you know what they care about, then you can find out a way to make them care about you.
Jason, your thoughts?
Yeah, my advice would be don't forget, government actors as influencers as well with platforms. I mean, Donald Trump, probably the most obvious example with a huge audience. But it isn't just Donald Trump who has, or somebody of that stature who has an audience. So it might not always be relevant, but I think you should always keep in the frame and consider whether a government audience, can be a source. I tell you, like, some who've done it really well might have ministers tour their factory, and next thing you know, thousands of people are learning about, what it is they do. So just keep them in mind and consider them as a potential influencer for you.
Jocelyn, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say get your ego out of the way. Make sure that the story passes, again, the so what test. You don't matter. It's whoever you want to consume the information or the product that actually matters. And if you think you're so great and that's all you pitch out there, it's not going to land. Again, that whole so what test, is the communication you're trying to put out there, the story you're putting out there, make sense to or matter to somebody else that you want to have it matter to? And I think also lose the buzzwords, keep the communication simple, clear, and concise. The number of things where I see we're strategically innovating new world problems that I don't even know, and they can just go on. That stuff gets lost in the void. And it's confusing and it's used by everyone. It doesn't matter what industry. So cut that out, cut the bullshit out really, and start using some more simple language.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, hey, folks, I really love this. I wish we had a lot more time to get into more of this, but thank you so much. And for everybody who's on the chat or on the webinar today, oh, thanks, Shannon, for putting that up. I was just going to say, follow everybody here on LinkedIn, because I follow all these folks and they have fantastic LinkedIn profiles, and they're all really interesting to keep in touch with, and and if you have follow-up questions, you can ask them directly. We also have a Curious Public newsletter that we do quarterly as well. If you go to our website, you can sign up for that. We deal with some of these issues in our blogs as well, and it's a good news roundup, just to kind of do a little plug for ourselves there. But Kevin, Molly, Jason, Jocelyn, huge thanks to each of you for taking an hour out of your busy schedules and days today to be with us. And a big thanks to our behind the scenes crew here who make these webinars possible. And the biggest thank you of all to all of you who joined us today. Thanks so much for taking time. And if you joined late, don't worry about it. We put the recordings up on our website, so keep your eyes peeled. And we'll send them to your inbox as well. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you for the next one.